Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about this book, The Botany of Desire, A Plant-Side View of the World by Michael Pollan. I picked this up a couple months ago, just walking through my little town in Virginia here, and this book was in one of those little lending libraries, where you can take a book, you can leave a book, and it was just sitting there, and I have a real interest in all things botany and horticulture, and so the title caught my eye. I had seen the author's name before, but had not read any of his books. He's written a lot of popular books. I think The Omnivore's Dilemma is maybe his most well-known book. I think a number of his books have been, New York Times bestsellers, that kind of thing. And so I thought, well, this sounds interesting. I picked it up and started to read it a little while ago and finished it a few weeks ago and wanted to give you my thoughts and review. So first off, let me introduce you to the author and what he's doing in this book, and then I'll give some of my kind of thoughts and assessment on the work, having read through it as a whole. So Michael Pollan is a journalist and professor. He taught science and environmental journalism at UC Berkeley. I think he's also taught at Harvard, and he is a prolific writer and author. Again, he's written a number of books. This book was published in 2001, and he's written several books since then. He also often gets asked to give talks. He's interviewed on different, talk shows or podcasts, things like that. So you'll come across his name a lot if you're interested in kind of, the science of food and nutrition. He has a number of things on, drugs and medications, which I'll talk about a little bit in interacting with this book. And so he's commonly, comes up in those conversations, both about food and about how we produce and distribute food in the modern Western world as well. His background is again in science journalism, so he has some familiarity with the scientific issues going on, but he's not himself, as far as I understand, a trained scientist. Rather, he's trying to kind of interact with those things and communicate it in a way that lay people can understand. And I have to say, it's easy to see why Michael Pollan is so popular and why his books have been so well received, because he is a very good writer. Just great turns of phrase, great images. He has a depth and breadth of learning and reading, and he's able to pull together some really fascinating threads. So I'll talk more about that as we kind of go through the book. But what he's doing in this book is something really fascinating. He's basically trying to walk us through the relationship that humans have had with plants over the centuries and millennia. And he does that by giving a chapter each on 4 different plants that have been significant for humanity, and that humanity has significantly influenced and impacted by its use. So he's dealing with the apple, he's dealing with the tulip, he's dealing with marijuana, and he's dealing with the potato. So it may seem like a kind of strange collection of plants to deal with there, but there's a method to the madness there. He's basically showing how each of these plants have met a kind of key human desire. And so he sees the apple as the answer to humanity's desire for sweetness. He's seen the tulip as meeting humanity's desire for beauty, marijuana as meeting humanity's desire for intoxication, and then the potato meeting humanity's desire for control. And what he's trying to do in each of these chapters is to look at the history of that plant, but to look at the history of humanity's interaction with that plant and ask the question, how has this plant impacted or benefited or changed our experience? But also, how has the attention that humanity has given to, the apple, the tulip, marijuana, potato, how has our attention to those plants changed the plant itself, the way that it is grown, the kind of varieties that it has produced, so on and so forth. And he does that, again, in a very, engaging and dynamic way. One of the things that he does is he kind of picks, a historical or narrative thread to run with as he looks at each of those plants. So when he's dealing with the apple, he gives a lot of attention to John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed, as most of us will know him, a big figure in early American history who had a huge impact on the spread and use of the apple in America and therefore around the world, coming from that. With the tulip, he goes back to the tulip mania of the Netherlands a few centuries ago. Some of you will be familiar with this history. The tulip became enormously popular. People were spending ridiculous amounts of money to buy a single tulip bulb, and the market just kind of skyrocketed and then collapsed and had this huge impact on the Dutch economy and everything. And he's just exploring, well, why is that? Why would rational Western European people be so intoxicated by this flower? Marijuana, he's obviously exploring, our complex relationships with plants that are classified as drugs and sometimes legal, sometimes illegal, and he's interacting with all of that. And then the potato, he's kind of tracing the more modern story that's playing out for us right now of how we have put a lot of controls on plants, genetically modifying and engineering them to produce and sustain our practice of monoculture, where we're growing, one plant in a field kind of thing, the kind of industrial economy of agriculture that's become very prominent, but wasn't historically the case. And he's dealing with the complexities that comes with that, the great possibilities it opens, and also the dangers that are attendant with it. So you can see, as he's kind of dealing with these different plants, he's doing so in a way that's very engaging. So, again, if you're someone who is a gardener, and he's very much writing as someone who loves plants himself, he's a gardener, he references his garden a lot, and he's got his own personal story that he interweaves with each of those 4 plants and the desires that they're meeting and so forth. But even if you're not really into plants, let's say you're not a gardener, you're not a farmer, you're not interested in these things at a botanical level, he does a great job of drawing out the kind of social and historical implications of this. So it's just a book that would be interesting for most people. And part of that is, Michael Pollan is one of these guys that you can just tell he's an interesting guy with a very active mind. And so even if you disagree with a lot of what he says, and I actually do, I'll get to some of that kind of disagreement and critique here in a moment, he's just a fascinating and stimulating author to interact with. So there's a reason, I think, why his books are popular, because, again, agree or disagree, there's a lot to learn from there, and he's just going to help you think in clearer ways, but also more creative ways. He's a very creative thinker and writer. One of the themes that he kind of weaves throughout his exploration of those 4 different plants is he kind of plays with this tension that exists in culture in general, and I think especially our relationship to plants and gardens and farming, between the Apollonian desires and the Dionysian desires. Now, what is he talking about there? Well, he's drawing on classical scholars of Greek mythology who note that there's this kind of this way of gardening, this way of growing, this way of interacting with plants that's very highly controlled, very orderly, very symmetrical, and that there's a kind of beauty that's associated with that. And it's kind of this idea of Apollo, right? This Apollonian desire for something that's very straight and defined and so forth. And that some gardens and some approach to farming and so forth very much lean heavily on that Apollonian instinct or paradigm. But he says in tension with that is this Dionysian instinct, which is all about revelry and wildness and nature and how again, other plants or our relationships with plants will play out more along those lines, and that often there's this kind of give and take, this back and forth that exists between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. So you'll see that thread running throughout, and he develops that in some really interesting ways. But one of the main things that he's doing, again, is to try and explore not just how these plants have impacted us, but how we as humans have impacted these plants. And one of the ways that he does that very heavily, this runs through every single chapter, is by leaning very heavily on an evolutionary framework for understanding the relationship of mankind to the plant world, and specifically to these 4 plants that he discusses. Now, I have to say something about that at this point, because I'm reviewing this book as a Christian pastor, and even more than that, a Christian pastor who is a young Earth creationist, right? And I've written or published some reviews on that topic. I'll try to post a link to what I think is the most helpful book on that subject, Faith, Reason, and Earth History by Arthur Chadwick and Leonard Brand, where they kind of go into all of that debate and give, I think, a very sound scientific assessment of Darwin, where it's helpful, where it has weaknesses. And I think having something like that in your mind is going to be very helpful as you come at this book. Because what's interesting is he will lean very heavily on the way that plants have adapted and changed over time, and how humanity has impacted and accelerated and modified that change in various ways with these plants. And he interprets that all within a very much Darwinian evolutionary framework. What's interesting for me as a young Earth creationist is that there's no concrete example of change and evolution that he gives that I couldn't acknowledge and agree with, because everything he's talking about is what we as creationists would understand as micro evolution, that there's development of species, of new species, and development within species as adaptation takes place over time, and certain genes are turned on or off, or and so forth. And so there's really nothing in terms of the facts that he's dealing with that I would disagree with. But what is interesting is that he leans very heavily on that Darwinian framework to interpret those facts. To me, it's just a highlighting of the fact that Darwinianism is as much a mythology as it is a methodology. It's as much a way of interpreting and looking at the world as it is a kind of cold, hard laying out of the facts. In other words, there's a lot of interpretation that's taking place. And in some ways, he's able to do that in a way that's very creative and helpful. In other ways, it's very much distorting. And so one of the themes that kind of comes out that I think is impoverished is that because God is no real part of his view, and because humanity is just one more creature's not even the right term for him, one more life form alongside these other life forms, humanity is often viewed as being just parasitic. Or what happens too, and this is kind of an interesting thing, is that he'll often want to sort of say like, oh, well, we think we're using the apple in this way, or we're using the tulip in this way, but actually maybe the tulip is using us because we have this love for beauty, and so we cultivate and perpetuate all these different varieties of tulips. And so actually the tulip is the one who has managed to leverage us, not the other way around, which is kind of a provocative, creative way of putting it. And you go, oh wow, that's amazing. But then of course what you're doing is ascribing a certain intelligence and purpose to the tulip that we don't have any reason to think exists, and it has the effect of kind of flattening out the difference between a man or a woman and a tulip, an apple and a human being. And that's part of that, again, Darwinian framework that sort of flattens that out. And I think that's a poor accounting for what we actually see in creation, that humanity exists as part of the creation, and yet also in a sense distinct from creation, that there is a meaningful difference between a man and a marijuana plant, between a woman and an apple tree, that humanity does have a different set of faculties and abilities and intention and will and purpose that is not shared with other creatures like plants. And yet that we also have a unique role to play. And this is where I think Pollan would benefit from a biblical imagination and framework instead of a Darwinian imagination. Because especially towards the end of the book, he begins to explore, in essence, the stewardship that we should have for creation and food. Now, he doesn't have that category, though. And so he has to deal in very kind of crass, mercenary terms as he talks about the way that our genetically modified foods can introduce huge dangers and problems to our food supply and our agricultural practices and so forth. I think that's a point where, I was just in my mind kind of going, oh, there's so much biblically here about our call and command to be stewards of creation, servants of God, to have a humility as we engage with the created order that would have really added force to his argument. But from a Darwinian perspective, kind of the most force you can get is, well, if we use and abuse these other things, it might down the road end up impacting our life, which is a very kind of crass mercenary argument. And he actually wants to go further than that. I just don't think he has good philosophical, theological grounds for going further than that. And that, to me, highlights one of the deficiencies intellectually, philosophically, with Darwinianism, particularly as a kind of mythos and framework. But so again, Michael Pollan is very much writing from that vantage point. But I think if you are a Christian who has a good grounding in those creation evolution issues and can understand that there's really nothing in here that's supporting Darwinian macroevolution. Really, what you're having here is examples of adaptation and microevolution that no Bible-believing Christian should have a problem with, then you can cut through some of the rhetoric there, and I think you can find something very provocative and helpful in some of the ways that Michael Pollan writes about our relationship to plants and how they shape us and how we have shaped them. So overall, a fascinating read if you're interested in any of these kinds of things. He's a good writer. Again, just the turns of phrase are wonderful. He interacts with, he'll pull in, quotes from, this poet and that philosopher and this story and that myth. And so it's a wide ranging work. One of the weaknesses of that, kind of the last thing I'll mention in terms of a comment or critique, there are a few points where, I am not an expert. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a botanist. So there's a number of those kinds of fields that I can't really speak to how he handles those things beyond just, my own general reading. But there are a few areas where I do have more background. Obviously, Christian theology is one, history is another. There are a few points where he would talk about, the Puritans, for example, or the Dutch Calvinists, or he talks about, the relationship of Christianity to pleasure and things like that. And you can tell he's dealing with caricatures that careful historians would disagree with, and I would disagree with. And so I would just encourage, take things with a grain of salt, question his assumptions at times, but you'll be benefited from engaging with his ideas. One of the last things I'll mention, I keep thinking of things to mention here. The chapter that may have stood out to you, and it stood out to me when I was kind of looking at the table of contents, was his chapter on marijuana. He is writing as an advocate for the use of marijuana and probably other drugs as well. He kind of makes the argument in the book that the American government has taken too tight of a view on what qualifies as a drug and what's legalized and not, and all of that. And so he's arguing for a loosening of those things. Interestingly, some of what he was wanting to see at this point, he wrote this again more than 20 years ago, he was sort of saying, everyone has this very dim view, but I think it will change. Well, we're actually seeing that view change. So it's very interesting from a social perspective to read how some of his arguments, and the argument, he's not the only one making the argument, but some of his arguments seem to be carrying the day in our culture more broadly. And that's something that we all have to be able to engage with and think about. So again, it's one of those areas where you might very well disagree. I was very skeptical of much of what he's saying in that chapter, but it's interesting to hear someone make the argument and to know how to kind of engage with that. So not a book for everyone, probably, but a book that I enjoyed reading. It was provocative and creative. It's well written. It's well thought through. Gave me some interesting categories and facts, and is something that is fun to kind of work through and discuss. So if you're interested in these things, I think it's worth picking up a copy of Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire.